1 live.
Hi everyone, I hope things are going well for you. I'm Yi Xin, co-president of BioSoc. Thanks very much for joining us for this talk. So before we start, here's a message from one of our sponsors, BitBio. BitBio is founded by Dr. Mark Cotter and Florian Schuster, and it is an award-winning human synthetic biology enterprise. Their mission is to code cells for health, and to do so, they apply the principles of computation to biology. Their current focus is to develop a scalable technology platform capable of producing consistent batches of every human cell. We would also like to thank another sponsor, CRISPR Biotech Engineering, an early-stage genome editing company using CRISPR-Cas9 to develop immunogenomics-based therapies, as well as providing educational resources. Today, we are very honored to have Professor Robin Dunbar as our speaker. Professor Robin Dunbar is Professor of Evolutionary Psychology from the University of Oxford. He's also an Emeritus Fellow of Magdalen College at Oxford and elected Fellow of the British Academy and the Royal Anthropological Institute. His principal research interests focus on the evolution of sociality, with particular reference to primates and humans. He's best known for the social brain hypothesis, the gossip theory of language evolution, and Dunbar's number, which is the limit on the number of relationships that we can manage. His publications include 15 authored or edited academic books and nearly 550 scientific journal articles. In addition, he has published a great deal of science print journalism in newspapers and magazines, and 11 popular science books, including 3 that are all due out this year. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Dunbar to deliver his talk.
Thank you very much. I'll just get the screen sharing up. So really what I'm going to talk about is stuff that we've been developing, or ideas that we've been developing for a very long time, really, getting on for the last 25 years, although the basis of some of these ideas go back to the 1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s, when I was a research fellow in Cambridge. But it's essentially trying to explain mammalian social evolution in general. And I don't really think we have a terribly convincing theory to explain why mammalian social systems have taken the form they have, and why we have differences between different groups. So just to highlight the issue, these are just the sort of range of group sizes that you get across a range of mammalian taxa. On the left are the carnivores, prosimian primates, 3 groups of anthropoid primates, the monkeys and apes, and then 2 groups on the right for the ungulates. So that's including both the antelope and the deer, and a few odds and sods like the sheep and the goats that sort of sit between them. And the point I want to make really is that for most mammals, group sizes are actually very small, typically less than 10 animals in total, and that's including everybody. But there are a couple of exceptions to this. One is essentially the herding ungulates, so species like plains antelope and many of the deer, who can manage much bigger groupings, on average something in the order of 25 to 30, but obviously some of these species, famously the wildebeest, when they're migrating, can go into herds of maybe 1 million animals, and they're absolutely huge, but that's somewhat untypical. Most of these herding species actually have modestly small groups, and typically somewhere in the region of sort of about 30. Now that's big, as you can see, by comparison with the sort of rest of the jobbing mammals, many of which, of course, are semi-solitary in their lifestyles. The other exception is the primates, and I've split the primates here into two groups, which turn out to be important, if you like. One is the bonded anthropoid primates. So these are monkeys and apes that have bonded social systems. The simplest bonded social system is monogamy, pair-bonded monogamy. But what's characteristic of all these species that in the monkeys and apes that have primate, so that have bonded social systems, is this intense form of sociality where individuals devote a lot of time to interacting with positively with each other. And you can describe many of these kind of relationships really in terms of friendships. They have the same characteristic of human friendships. The exception to these are the handful of species, perhaps only 3 or 4 at the most, that have fission fusion systems built on top of a bonded social system. It's species like the gelada baboon, which have family groupings or harems, which are typically about 10 to 15 animals in size, but these cluster together in these very large groups, which in many ways have the kind of feel of ungulate herds. They come and go, and they break up, and they coalesce and so on. And these type of primate groupings, these bonded groupings, are very different to the kind of much simpler groupings involving much less social interaction that you get in the other, primarily monkeys, the simpler monkeys, if you like. And just to highlight this issue of bondedness, these are data on the proportion of genera in different social categories for, again, the ungulates, the carnivores, the prosimian primates here, that's the lemurs and galagos, and the anthropoid primates, the monkeys and apes. And I'm just really point out the extent to which ungulates and carnivores and even prosimians have a very high proportion of unbonded social groups. The carnivores, and that's mainly the dog family actually that produces this, and the lemurs have a large number of monogamous pair-bonded species, a single male and a single female that kind of stick together. But ungulates, by and large, these kind of bonded groups are quite rare. This is one of the exceptions here, Klipspringer, a small miniature antelope that I've spent many years studying in East Africa. Intensely social, the male and female on hardly ever greater distances than what you can see there apart. They have all the characteristics of primate social bonds. So this kind of thing that you see up here with where there's some baboons grooming each other intensely. And it's these anthropoid species that seem to have this very high, relatively very high frequency of bonded social groups, these large social groups which are intensely bonded with each other, as well as obviously monogamous pairs, and relatively less common these generic mammalian unbonded groups. So this is what we're trying to explain, really. There's an important distinction here that's kind of been lost sight of, I think, over the last few decades. That's the distinction between aggregations and congregations. So aggregations effectively are herds which are casual, they come together, they fragment very easily, they're often driven by food availability, a rich food source, lots of animals congregate on a nice patch of grass. But as they eat it all up, they kind of disperse and off on their own. And the contrast here is with these bonded groups or congregations where the animals are permanently together, forming these very, very intense groups. So these congregation types at bonded social systems, we have the baboons here as a typical primate. The Klipspringer is a rare but not too infrequent pair bonding ungulate, and then a sort of generic ungulate feral goats, which I've also spent more time than I care to remember studying off the west coast of Scotland and Wales, who are much more typical of herding mammals in general and herding ungulates in particular. These groups come and go and break up, and depending on foraging, richness of the habitat they're in, and you know, whether some individuals want to go and rest when everybody else wants to carry on feeding, and so the part of the group drifts away. Now that will never happen in these kind of species. If Klipspringer's female starts feeding and starts moving off, even if he's been resting for some time, he will get up and go with her. The two of them will stay in very, very close contact. They're constantly watching each other. And you can see that in these data here, which are the frequencies with which animals look at each other within the group. And here you've got gelada baboons, which have these very intensely bonded families embedded within these very large herds. The Klipspringer here, and you can see how often the male and female are checking each other to make sure what they're up to, compared to the feral goats down here. It's actually this population, data from this population here, who hardly ever bother to look at each other. So the key distinctions really is the amount of time that these bonded species invest in bonded mechanisms. In primates, that's grooming. They're constantly monitoring each other. They have to be willing to compromise on activity budget demands in order to keep the group together. You simply cannot take time out and go to rest if everybody else is going to carry on feeding and wandering away from you. You have to go with the flow, as it were. And on top of that, and part of that really is this fact that they have to manage multiple individual relationships. So it makes a big difference how that this male here, for example, understands the relationship between this female and what's probably her daughter here, so that he knows, you know, that if he upsets the daughter, the mother will come to her aid. I mean, these might be two adult females who have a grooming relationship in other cases, but they understand 3- and 4-way relationships. They know what the consequences of their actions are if they behave in certain ways. And that's crucial to keeping these groups together. Okay, so let me show you one other key bit of information that sets the scene for this story, and that's the distribution of primate group sizes. We really tend, and I suppose the lesson I'm trying to get across here is that we tend to make very simplifying assumptions or theory-based assumptions about what animals do and the traits they have, which actually paper over some very large cracks in reality, and that sometimes we really need to kind of look left field at the animals we're studying and not assume simple-minded statistical distributions in this case. So typically most people would look at data like this and go, oh, it's nearly normal. This is just a normal distribution. So there's a typical group size for primates and some variance around that. And the answer is no. Start to burrow down into these data, it turns out to be much, much more complex and much more interesting. Now, here are the prosimians down here in green. These are the anthropoid primates, the monkeys and apes up here. The prosimians kind of, yeah, okay, it looks a bit like a normal distribution with some outliers perhaps, but the anthropoids show a very, very different structure. This is clearly multimodal. There are a series of modes, and if you do a proper cluster analysis of these data to look for patterns in the data, it turns out that actually you've got a set of 4 distinct distributions in these data, each with its own mode, and those modes occur at round about 6, 16, 30, and 53, and then the prosimians are actually mapped on top of that with 2 overlapping modes at 7 and 15, and then a very small one down here at about 2.5. And you'll see the relevance of these numbers a little later on. It's okay if you I've lost a slide, but never mind. Okay, so why are these animals living in groups? That's the central driver of what's going on from an evolutionary point of view. realistic, I mean, there are some exceptions to this because of biparental care, which is mostly things like the dog family as a big exception to everything that all other mammals do. And some of the primates who tend to have a fairly high frequency of monogamous social groups, some of those have biparental care, but by no means all. So there are some exceptions, but otherwise, I think generally in birds and mammals as a whole, the reason animals gather together in groups, whether those groups are stable and permanent or temporary herds, is really predation. So it's the effective predation, pressure on animals. And here's some data from some of Suzanne Schultz's studies of the impact predation rates on different groups of mammal prey, antelope, giant rats, forest floor rats, primates, as a function of group size on a log scale here. And there are, if you separate out terrestrial prey who are at much greater risk than arboreal prey always, there is a very strong, significant relationship between predation rate, a negative relationship between predation rate and social group size. So species that live in small groups get hammered. And what's more, if you look at brain size, this is a composite set of data of leopard predation from 3 separate sites. There's a very strong negative relationship that essentially predators hammer small brain species. Of course, small brain species tend to live in small groups. So that's your principal reason for living in groups. The cost of living in groups and what creates the kind of balance, the optimization process that leads to an optimal group size for a species, is the balance between predation and the stresses of living in groups. Now, for I don't know how long, probably close on a century actually, we've assumed that these costs are essentially foraging costs, that animals compete over food in one form or another, either directly by stealing each other's food, maybe, which is effectively what's going on here among these wolves, or indirectly by eating food that another animal could have eaten, so forcing the group to move, perhaps forcing individuals to leave in search of better feeding sites. Now, this is kind of classic big style ecological theory, which everybody just takes for granted. The problem is, in many ways, the evidence for that isn't all that good. It's correlational to start with, and there isn't an awful lot of evidence to show that there are direct nutritional effects of feeding competition in either of these forms as group size increases. Yes, animals get narky with each other, and as these animals are getting here, over other individuals pinching what they think is their bit share of the food, as it were. But by and large, that just requires you to move a bit further away. It doesn't require you to leave a group. What it has turned out to be the case, and we've been completely left-fielded by this, and we've only really recently discovered this, as most of the stuff is not yet published. If you look at the fertility of mammal species, so here's a bunch of species: badgers, feral goats. These are my feral goats up on the Isle of Rum. Barbarissa, which are a pig from South Asia, marmots from America, rodents, giant rodents, some of the big rodents. The fertility correlates negatively with the size of the group. Now, the important thing about all these species is that even the social ones, like the badgers and goats, primarily are groups of females. Many of the other species are semi-solitary, so the Barbarissa in particular are semi-solitary, quite small groups, and the groups simply consist of females, and they're young, and males are very transient members only during the mating season. So this is, for that reason, plotted against the number of females. But what you can see is the more females in the group, the lower the frequency of litters per female per year. Something is going on here. And in some cases, this is really steep, because the fertility is getting down to below the level at which the population would sustain itself, when groups are still quite small, something around 5 to 10 females is the most that they can manage to have in a group. After that, they're heading for extinction very, very fast. So that's limiting the size of the groups, and one would expect females that are up at this kind of end up here, where their fertility is now very low, to be looking very carefully, if you like, at ways of getting out of this and improving their condition. It seems in these species, they can't, the only way of solving that problem is simply to leave the group and join a smaller one. And as it turns out, there is loads and loads of evidence for this effect all over the whole of the mammals. So here's a range of studies from a range of species, ranging from rodents up here, marmots, which we've just seen, meerkats and squirrels, the hyenids, the horses, the horse family, the canids, and primates, from the relatively small, relatively asocial species to the very intensely social species down here, and even in humans. There's good data to show this in humans. And what seems to be happening is in these relatively asocial species up at this top end here, that fertility decline is limiting group size very strongly. But that in these more intensely social species, particularly in the primates and the equids, they've found a solution to that problem, which in effect allows them to defer that fall off in fertility as a function of group size. This is not true of the canids here, because all the canids are pair bonded. They only have one breeding female and one breeding male, typically, in a pack. Now we know what the cause of this is. This was worked out by Barry Cavern in Cambridge in the 1970s and 1980s, and a bunch of other people in Edinburgh as well. It really is a consequence of the way the mammalian reproductive endocrinology system is designed, and the way it works is as a cascade of neurohormones that start up in the brain, and particularly in the hypothalamus, which trigger through the pituitary and other units a cascade of neurohormones that eventually gives rise to a luteinizing hormone surge. And that luteinizing hormone surge kicks in ovulation. If that luteinizing hormone surge doesn't happen, there will be no ovulation. You have what looks like a perfectly ordinary menstrual cycle, but it's not fertile. There's no ovulation in the center of it. Eventually the system will collapse and there'll be conventional menstruation will happen and back into the next cycle. It turns out that let's just point out first that the principal reason why this system can crash, if you like, or be switched off, is simply that the system is designed to prevent the female being able to be pregnant at the same time as she's lactating, because both are so costly energetically to the female that by and large, it's simply not possible to do. And especially if you have long-lived, slow-growing infants like the primates in particular do, where the female may be having to support the infant, not only for a very long period of lactation, in sort of standard old world monkeys, for example, the pregnancy lasts about 6 months, but lactation lasts at least a year, pushing into 18 months maybe. So to have pregnancy at the same time as lactation would just overload the female beyond what she can bear. And so you have this mechanism that cuts the system off right at the outset up here in the brain. So there's no cascade that happens. Now that's just part of the way the system is designed, but it turns out that is then very susceptible to the effects of stress for reasons that I won't go into, but have to do with the role of prolactin and endorphins kicking in. Well, actually, the prolactin bit is perhaps just easy to explain in this context, because that, of course, is what's involved in lactation and milk letdown when the infant starts suckling. And the high levels of prolactin that are kicking around in the system just cut off the cascade, the endocrine cascade leading to ovulation, and block it completely. And this system is incredibly sensitive because it responds only to the frequency with which the baby suckles. So if the frequency of suckling in any mammal, from small ones to humans, if the frequency of suckling drops below one bout of suckling in every 4 hours, the reproductive endocrine system is released, and the female will go back into menstrual cycling. But if the rate of suckling is higher than that, it will be blocked. But it turns out that social and physiological stress will also block the system in the same way. And that's partly as it's thought to be a response to endorphins released to both of these, which help to dampen the stresses. Now, it's these that are important, because it's purely social stresses that can do this. You don't need any kind of nutrient stress to trigger this. And so what's emerged out of the non-ecological literature is that starvation, i.e. shortage of food, will only have this effect if the amount of the weight loss involved is greater than 15% of body weight. And that is a huge amount to lose. And indeed, there's some nice data from Radir, for example, showing that it's only in females in the lower quartile of weight loss. I put that the other way around. The upper quartile of weight loss have lost most weight over winter, that are unable to become infertile in the following breeding season. But essentially, when starvation does have this effect, it's actually using this same mechanism. It's operating through the endorphin system, much as social stress seems to do. Okay, so that's the mechanism, and it's extremely sensitive. And in humans, you can switch menstrual cycles in and out simply with very, very heavy circuit training. You need, and that's sort of pushing down this route, as it were. But in effect, it's what you're introducing is that very, very heavy load. Okay. Now this effect of psychological stress or social stress on fertility is very well known in the agricultural industry. But of course, biologists never read what's in the agricultural journals, because it's captive animals and not very interesting. But it seems that this has been a major problem for farming, particularly of cattle. It's been a perennial problem. It took them a long time to sort out, but they've eventually figured out that what was going on is it's the stocking rate of the animals. It's not the food. You can put as much food and as rich a pasture as you like in there. If there's too many animals on it, just them bumping into each other in effect and stressing each other out hammers fertility, and they're not producing babies at the rate at which you would expect them to do. So, and the agricultural people really only worked this out in the 1990s, early 2000s, I think. So it's very, very new. So here's what happens in primates. So remember, I showed you how in sort of generic, less intensely social animals, you just have a negative relationship between fertility and social group size, and particularly the number of females. This is what the primate data look like. There are some species here, one of the calatricids, the marmosets from South America, showing this negative decline. There are a few species that show that, but the majority, and particularly the ones with bonded social systems, so all these old world monkeys and the apes down here that have bonded social systems, all have these humped curves, and including the only really large group living lemur. I mean, they don't live in enormous groups by the size of those that monkeys and apes have, but they're the most social of all the lemurs, and they are showing the same pattern too. In other words, what they seem to have done is push this fertility decline to the right here, so that it happens somewhere over here. But as a result of, and that allows them to live in much bigger groups, but the cost of doing that seems to be that you introduce an upward trajectory on the left-hand side. So the question is, how have monkeys and apes solved this? And I hasten to say, you see the same effect. You see much the same pattern in horses, these U-shaped, inverted U-shaped pattern in horses, in some of the social scurids, the mongooses. I haven't looked at data for meerkats, but I think, well, I know they have a negative effect. Whether they have it's essentially this right-hand side that they're showing. I haven't actually looked to see if they've got a hump curve, but and also you see it in things like the lions, which are the only seriously social cat. Most of the cats, remember, are solitary. So how have these species solved it? Well, the answer is by forming coalitions. So it's females forming these very intense grooming cliques, which then have the effect of buffering themselves against the stresses of living with large numbers of other people. So here are some classic cases, Japanese macaques here, some of the gelada from my studies in Ethiopia many, many years ago. These are more gelada down here. You can see the females here. This is an argy-bargy between two families foraging together. Somebody's trodden on somebody's toes and upsets somebody, and they end up having a sort of shouting match at each other. It usually starts with the females. You know, one female will get in another female's way from another group. There'll be a bit of an argy-bargy. Her grooming partners here will come to her aid, and if it doesn't settle down, eventually the males get pulled in to add their weight to the argument. There's a lot of shouting and screaming and yelling, but it never kind of blows up. Usually when everybody's had a good shout, they call it quits and go back to feeding again. They separate, the two families will separate off and go back to feeding. But the point is, this is kind of very stressful. But you've also got the same stresses going on, not only between subgroups of the larger community, if you like, but also within the harem family units themselves. So the different little cliques, grooming cliques of females, badgering away at each other, stressing each other out. Again, here are baboons, but it's this intense amount of grooming, huge quantity of grooming that they do, that creates these buffers against other people. And it's largely just keeping everybody off your back. It doesn't often end up with these kind of fights, don't often occur. What it's mainly, the way it mainly seems to work is it simply keeps everybody off your back, because you know that if you try doing something like stealing the food from this one or chasing her off, then her grooming partner, her coalition partner, will come to her aid. So it's understanding these kind of three-way relationships then becomes very crucial in these kind of social systems. So here's how it works. This is a comparison of my data from two different species of prime monkeys that I worked on. Colobus monkeys, which have very low-key social systems, relatively small groups. The gelada, which live in similar-sized family groups, but are much more intensely social because these family groups are embedded in very large communities. So you have a contrast really between a less intensely social primate and a more intensely social primate. Now here's the fertility data for Colobus. A very, very strong negative relationship between the birth rate per female and the number of females in the group. It sets an absolute upper limit 7 females in the group, because at that point fertility is 0, which means you're heading fast for extinction. But actually anywhere below about somewhere here, you'll go into negative growth, negative population dynamics. So in reality, the limit on group size is probably closer to 5. Females always account for a third of total number of animals in the group in primates, so that sets an upper limit at about 15 on group size, which is what you see in colobus monkeys. If you look at the gelada, what you see is this hump-shaped format again, with group size being, or the limit on group size being pushed right over here, allowing them to have much, much bigger groups. And indeed, the somewhere around sort of 20 to 25 is the upper limit of the size of their harem unit. So the equivalent social grouping as this lot is 2 or 3 times as big. And the reason, or the way this works, is just illustrated here with a couple of bits of data on the network structures of the relationships within these groupings. If you look at the density of relationships that occur, so this is all the possible dyadic contacts that actually exist where animals are grooming each other as a proportion of the total number of dyads in the group, plotted against the size of the group, the number of adults in the group. You can see that gelada lie above the colobus. They're able to maintain higher densities for any given group size. And as that becomes important, as group size increases, they can maintain coherence and stability of the group at much higher groups. And again, if you look at betweenness and centrality, which is just a measure of how easily the group would fragment if you took somebody out, essentially. In the colobus, it really is just a negative relationship. Although the data are very scattered, so that's not a significant relationship. But in the gelada, with these very intensely bonded groups, with many different connections that exist between the grooming patterns of different individuals, it's actually positive. They become more integrated as group size increases, and as they're sort of working to keep the group coherent. So these colobus groups will just drift apart and separate once they get too big, whereas the gelada groups, they will invest time and effort in trying to keep the group stable and coordinated. Okay, so let's just have a look more closely at some aspects of the baboons, because baboons are, by monkey standards, probably the smartest of the lot. They're extremely, relatively large brains, extremely smart animals. That not in the ape league, clearly, but they're at the top of the monkey tree. They're terrestrial, open country, live in very, very large bonded groups. And here's the distribution of group sizes in baboons. I think this is something like 400 groups sampled all over Africa. Just the frequency distribution. You can see again, the easy tendency is to look at that and go, oh, yeah, well, it's really a normal distribution with some tails around either side. But in fact, it turns out not to be. If you again do cluster analysis to look at the packing of groupings, the distribution of patterns, the fractal patterns of group size, what emerges is something that looks much more like this. Essentially what it's saying is that there are 4 separate normal distributions which overlie each other to create the pattern you see overall, but actually it consists of 4 separate, quite distinct normal distributions, each of which has a different mode. The scaling ratio between these successive modes, so that's the ratio of that to that and that to that, is very close to 2, and that suggests that it's about fission, that what's creating these modes is whether animals allow the group to split, and when they split, they're almost always split in roughly half, hence the scaling ratio of 2, that at some populations are just allowing group size to increase to a point where they kind of slip over into the next mode, if you like. So what we think is going on here is that you've actually got 3 nonlinear oscillators here, demographic oscillators. That each oscillator will be characteristic of a population and will be defined by the characteristics, the environmental characteristics of that population. And what happens is group size increases steadily, reaches the point where fertility starts to kick in or decline. And at that point, they go fission, and group size flips back to the bottom of the oscillator. So they're just kind of oscillating around. But you seem to have 3 separate oscillators of increasing size. So these are very, very big groups here, running up to something in the order of 170 animals maybe, but having a lower limit here at about 75, 80 animals. But the group size is just kind of looping around here, and they never go down to here. So here's essentially how it works. This is data for different baboon populations all over Africa. Each data point is one population, mostly one group. It's the birth rate per year plotted against total group size. And you can see again this nice humped relationship. Here's the midpoint of it, and that is actually right bang on the average group size for the species or the genus as a whole. Around 50-55 is the average. But what we think is actually happening is that you've got this oscillator running in here, whereby group size increases steadily. You start to get to the point where it flattens out and is going down here. So what the females do is drive fission, which splits the group into brings it back down to these smaller group sizes, and you just oscillate round. So this is very slow, and then it's precipitate. And that the same thing's happening on the other side, but the other way around. As group size is increasing, fertility is declining. It gets to the point where the females really can't allow fertility to fall any further. So they want out, and they split precipitously, go back to the smaller lower limit within that oscillator. And that what's driving these 2 oscillators is predation risk, because these populations are all in low predation risk habitats. These populations are all in high predation risk habitats. And what you essentially have, and this turns out to be a beautiful ESS, if you calculate the fitness payoffs for the females in terms of where they split. So they could split anywhere between here and here into these two oscillators. The 2 halves achieve equal fertility for fitness as measured by lifetime output fertility only if you split them here at this point, which is where they actually do. So this is very slow growth, much more stable. This is very fast growth, much less stable, but you need to have these big groups in order to cope with higher predation pressure. So what's driving this hump shape effect? Well, a classic argument in ecology and behavioral ecology for 50 years probably has been, whenever you get a hump shape like that, it's almost always because you've got a trade-off between 2 factors, one of which is increasing and the other of which is decreasing. In other words, you've got something that's increasingly beneficial, producing higher fitness as group size increases, but acting against that is another factor which is causing fitness to decline as group size increases, and hence you end up with these U-shaped curves. So the question is, what are these likely to be? Group size is kind of the obvious one to look at, and it's very plausible to suppose that this upward trajectory is driven by group size, because it's about protection from predators. That's the big thing they have to worry about. Territory defense against conspecifics, maybe, and or some combination of the 2. But by and large, group size the functions of group size are largely going to be driven by these two factors. What might cause the decline? The two most obvious, the other two bits that are kind of left over demographically. One is males creating between sex stress, and the other is females causing within sex stress. And here's the sad story of my entire research life, is that I've actually spent 40 years assuming that this is what's been driving it. And this came out of working on feral goats. Feral goats down here have the most extraordinary mating system you can imagine, because it's absolutely frenetic in the rut. I mean, red deer ruts pale to insignificant compared to what's going on. These males are just harassing females left, right, and center. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to look at how male-male competition effectively over the back of the females might be stressing out the females and causing infertility through blocking the ovulatory endocrinology. And it's the same in humans. It's all these species spend lots of times with sort of guys fighting each other, or driving their motorbikes in herds around the village at 12 o'clock at night and making a big hassle and noise and all these kind of things. And it's turned out we were completely barking up the wrong tree. So if you take, I mean, this is all done on the primate data, if you take the fertility data for the various primate genera that we've looked at. So this is the birth rate data, it's actual fertility data for 12 main genera of primates. This is immatures per female, so it's a longer time span. Just look, but essentially the derivative of fertility, less losses along the way for a much larger sample. And then you simply ask, well, what best predicts fertility in these various populations? Is it group size, number of males and number of females in the group? And you can just do a standard multiple regression. These are the standardized slopes, so they're the strength of the effect, as it were. Well, here we are. Group size is very nicely positive. 0 here is no effect at all. Group size is in both these is way above 0. That's obviously driving the upslope there. But look where the males are. They're sitting bang on 0. They're actually having very little effect. It's the females that are creating the problem, if you like. They're the ones with the negative slopes and producing this downturn at the end. So whatever they're doing, it's somehow they interfere with each other's endocrinological systems. So here's the problem then with these bonded sociality systems. So this is how the females are solving the problem up to a point and getting it, sort of allowing them to live in bigger groups, is by forming these bonded social systems. They're based on grooming, which is hugely costly in terms of time. And these species here, the gelada, will devote as much as 20% of the 15 to 20% of their total daytime to social grooming. That's a huge amount to take out. There's no way you need that amount to keep the fur clean. It's purely about creating bonded relationships. Now, over the last 5-10 years, we've understood the mechanisms involved, because it turns out there's a very specialized set of neural systems in the skin, these C-tactile, afferent C-tactile neurons, which sit at the base of each hair follicle and only respond to light, slow stroking at almost exactly 2.5 centimeters a second, which is the speed of hand movements as the animal's moving the fur out of the way when it's grooming. And you can show, that this really is very critical to the actual speed. If you try doing it, and we still do this, actually, we've shown this with neuroimaging studies, we still respond to this light, slow stroking at this speed. And if you do it at 30 centimeters a second rather than 2.5 centimeters a second, you get absolutely no effect at all. But this grooming sends signals down the C tactile system up into the brain and triggers the endorphin system. It's the endorphin system in the brain that underpins primate and indeed human social bonding and floods the brain with endorphins, and you feel very kind of relaxed and happy and trusting with whoever you're doing this with, and that's how the bonds are essentially built up. But in addition to that, there's a cognitive component, which is about understanding things like third-party relationships, and it's these two components here in particular: the ability to inhibit prepotent actions, that's say not grab the big slice of cake off the table before everybody else has had a chance to get at it, and the ability to mentalize, because that allows you to understand what the consequences of your action for third-party individuals are in the system. And so what it produces is what's often known as a two-part mechanism in terms of creating relationships. One is this very intense pharmacological process, like raw feels, deeply buried below consciousness in many ways, that involves social grooming in the endorphin system, and then this cognitive component, which is the social brain hypothesis. And in terms of the cognitive demands, it turns out that these cognitive requirements depend on specific neural systems which primarily only exist in the anthropoid primates, that's say the monkeys, apes, and humans. One is the frontal pole up here, this area here, Brodmann area 10, which only occurs in anthropoid primates. It allows them to engage in causal reasoning. A causes B, B causes C, therefore A causes C. One trial learning, so they can learn a rule on the basis of one observation instead of having to learn by association learning. Analogical reasoning, A is to B as C is to D. Comparing of alternative outcomes, and of course inhibition, this ability to inhibit. And then the other one is what's known as the default mode neural network, which supports mentalizing and managing social relationships, which involves a huge neural circuit from up here in the prefrontal cortex, the orbital frontal and medial frontal cortex, the parietal temporal temporoparietal junction here between the junction between these two lobes, big chunks of the temporal lobe, and then in addition to that, links down, particularly from the orbital frontal cortex into the limbic system, which responds to emotional cues, and between this whole lot down into the cerebellum. This has only really just been shown. And what seems to be important there is precisely that one of the jobs the cerebellum does is to coordinate sequences of processing up here. It's always been seen as managing balance and things like that, but of course that's precisely the point. What it's doing is coordinating neural firing up here so that you don't fall over, but it also seems to be hugely importantly involved in processing social information. All right, and just some evidence that these increase in these competences increase across primates. So this is, I'll show you these in a second. Grades of sociality across primates, so from the very asocial primates to the very intensely social primates, primarily apes up here. The capacity, these general executive functions like causal reasoning and so on increase as a function of brain size and the grade you're in. Various measures of inhibition, here's 3 different ones: time discounting, go, no go tasks, and inhibition in general, again, also increase with brain size and with the social grade you're in. And then some nice data showing that it's kind of pre-mentalizing rather than formal mentalizing as we have in humans, otherwise known as theory of mind, but it's the kind of underpinnings of that also increase across the primates. So there's some real cognitive components that reflect the tasks, the cognitive tasks the animals have to do. So here's the other link really in the pin, is that when we plot the data that's kind of become iconically associated with the social brain size, which is simply group size plotted against neocortex ratio, the ratio of the neocortex to the to the subcortical brain, and you have this general relationship. Everybody's assumed, even though I said it wasn't the case in 1993, but everybody assumes that it's a simple linear relationship. It's actually taken us 20 years to figure out how to show this statistically, but finally we've managed to do it. That if you kind of decompose the distributions here, what you actually find is 4 very distinct grades. And they're complete mix of taxa, which is what made it very difficult to do, because conventional phylogenetic methods for doing these kind of analysis simply don't apply in these cases. We had to figure out another way of doing it. But these are relatively asocial prosimians and New World monkeys, a complete mix of prosimians, New World monkeys, and Old World monkeys in 2 separate grades. So these are the sort of not very smart monkeys. These are the smarter monkeys. And finally, the apes with a few very smart Old World monkeys thrown in for good measure. And here's the key thing, because this is what's caused a lot of problems, is whenever people have done analyses using to test the social brain hypothesis against some other alternative, what they've been doing is simply running a standard linear regression against these data. Well, the problem is, if you have a lot of variance and error variance in the data, that lowers the slope. So they've been using that slope as their measure of the relationship and using that to predict what you might expect, when in fact they should have been using, or we all should have been using these grades here and separating them out. It makes it more complicated, but nobody said that life and biology were that necessarily simple. But it makes it a lot more interesting. And you can see the difference in the goodness of fit here between these grade lines and the overall standard regression. And just to make it clear how general this is there's exactly the same relationships done for 4 other different data sets. So this is 1 brain data set. These are 4 other different brain data sets for primates, and they all produce this grade structure. So this is essentially how primates do it. This is the case of the gelada. What they're doing is forming a layered structure, a multi-layered structure. So you've got here a harem unit. These would be individuals down at the bottom. You've got little coalitions within that forming a harem unit or a family unit. So there's pairs or trios of females in here that form a little cluster, but all together they form a bigger cluster. The little grooming cliques will act to buffer the females against the rest of their harem, but then the harem itself is a buffer against all these guys out here. And the next layer up is the team, where you've got several harem units clustering together to form a team, who are the product of fission in the past, as these harem units are becoming too big to maintain their coherence. They'll split, but they will maintain these relationships socially and spatially, so that they stick together even within these big herds. And then sort of the team buffers you against all them out there. So you've got a sort of layered series of social units. And if you look at how these layered multi-level social systems structure and lie in terms of the grades, then it becomes very, very clear, I think, that actually what determines the size the species has is simply where it lies on the grade. So here's the 4 grades that I showed you in the couple of slides ago. These are data for human grouping sizes, different sizes of human clusters. These are the same for chimpanzees. These are baboons. These are the gelada. So here are their harems. Oh no, these these are their cliques, forming harems, forming teams, forming bands. Gorillas here. This is a standard gorilla group, and now we've just discovered within the last 4 or 5 years that they live in communities of related groups, genetically related groups. They obviously had a common ancestry before. These are all average. These are all averages for relatively large samples of groups. But you can see how the individual values sit very closely on the whole round particular layers in these groupings on the grades. And then it turns out below the 4 grades we've looked at, so this is group size as we see it. This is the substructuring within groups, essentially, this 5th grade down here, that these are somehow attractors or sweet points at which things seem to work and hang together very well. And if the animals go too far, the group size increases too far for the size of their brain, they end up having to split. Now, they either split into 2 unrelated groups, or in these smart species up here, they can hold the products of those fissions together in extended groups. It's really very, very clever in the way they do it. I mean, it's an extremely hard thing to do. And just to show you how this works, here is your social world. This is your personal social world. You're sitting in the center here of a series of layers which have very distinct sizes, with each layer being 3 times the size of the layer within it. So you've got here essentially what are intimate friends on the whole. You know, some people have 1, some people have 2. You've got a set of close friends here, which includes these 1.5 in here, making up a group of 5. Best friends, about 15, and these are friends and family, I should say as well. So, but remember, they're cumulative. You're hitting the red bar up here to 150, otherwise known as Dunbar's number, this limit on the size of social circles that people have on average. And then beyond that are some more layers. We know there's a layer up to 500, a layer at 1500, and beyond that, another layer, the outermost layer is at 5, that we know of, is at 5,000. After that, people are just completely anonymous. Now, aside from the fact that you can see these patterns of layering come off, if you look at the frequencies with which people phone each other in their social networks, the frequencies with which they post named posts on Facebook and things like that. And in fact, here our data is showing that. So this is a Facebook data set. I promise we didn't get it from Cambridge Analytica, nor Oxford Analytica, whoever they might be. This is a publicly available Facebook data set, which has been kicking around for a long time. These are data crawled from Twitter. These are a huge national cell phone database base from one European country. It's not Britain. But it is a very large country. And here are face-to-face data. So these come from our surveys of the number of friends that people have. And you can see how tightly all these data sets cluster around these values. These are the nominal values here: 1.5, 5, 15, 50, 150. This is the limit of your social network. And here are the primate group sizes mapped onto that. And you know, they map exactly the same as ours. Now, these are the distribution of group sizes in primates. So what seems to be happening here is that primates are doing exactly the same thing. Now, some of them sit down here, perhaps with only group sizes of about 5, which tends to be monogamous pairs, I guess. But the species that go up to larger group sizes, so chimpanzees and baboons, which have kind of average group sizes around about the sort of 45 to 55 mark, what it looks like is they consist of subsets of, let's say, 3 subgroupings of 15, which in turn consist of 3 subgroupings of 5. So the way these multi-level systems are built up is simply by delaying fission, and you end up with what you had before. But now what you do is you've got a set of other groups similar to yours who would have left at one time, but you can now hold in place. Okay, so essentially what we think is going on is there are 2 routes here to sociality in the mammals in general. There's the kind of herding fission fusion route. It's very, very flexible. It minimizes the fertility cost of the animals because you just leave if it gets too much for you and go off on your own or with fewer individuals. It minimizes the time cost because you don't have to waste time fighting to get food, as it were, or indeed you don't have to invest in relationships. There are no kind of stable friendships type relationships in these groups, but you bear a cost of the risk of being caught alone on the one occasion when a predator turns up and you've just left your group and gone off on your own. So you're mincemeat for somebody's lunch. And as a result, you incur much higher predation risk than that. And the solution that these bonded social groups, primarily the anthropoid primates, but also the equid family, the horse zebra family, the elephants, the dolphins, the delphinids, and most surprising of all, I think, the camel family, the tylopods, they also have these bonded social groups, these particularly South American species, the vicuña and so on. But the key is you're never on your own. You will always have somebody there to buffer you against or scare off the predators, as it were, as a result of which you have much, much lower predation mortality. But it comes at a cost. They're much less flexible. You can only split them at certain sizes of groups to produce those kind of layerings that I showed you. It bears a huge fertility cost, and you have to solve that fertility cost. To keep the group together, you have to be able to synchronize your activities with each other, rather than what happens with antelope and deer is they just drift apart, which means you've got to pay attention to what everybody else is doing, compromise with what they want to do. You need to invest very, very heavily in cognition, which means a big, expensive brain. And you have to invest a lot of time in social bonding. For primates, that's principally done through social grooming. And in terms of time consumption, that is huge cost to them. The very, very social species are spending 15 to 20% of their total day engaged in social grooming. So at this point, I'm going to end. These are my two latest books. This came out earlier in the year, which is a sort of a guide to evolutionary processes, and this is coming out in, I think, 2 weeks' time, which kind of sums up a lot of this stuff, but specifically in the context of humans. There's a little bit of primate stuff in there, but it's mostly humans. Okay, I shall stop there. I shall get rid of the screen sharing, and we can go back to Yi, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Dunbar, for that fantastic talk. So I will be moderating the Q&A session. If you are on Zoom, you can feel free to just unmute yourself and ask questions. You could post them on the chat, or you could send them privately to me. And if you're on YouTube, just post your questions on the chat. So maybe I'll start off with one question regarding the factors that could cause, the stresses that can cause reduced fertility. So you mentioned prolactin and endorphins as two hormones involved. But yeah, I'm just quite curious about how endorphin causes these problems, because I think most of us know that endorphin provides the feeling of pleasure and the reduced stress. So yeah.
The answer is buried in journals of the kind of reproductive endocrinology kind. So there's been a huge amount of work on this. I can't give you chapter and verse essentially on all this, but what's in effect, in a kind of very simple minded sort of sense, what seems to be happening is that the release of endorphins is triggered by any stress on the body, psychological or physical. And indeed, remember, the endorphins are part of the brain's pain management system. So we feel pain, psychological pain, in exactly the same bit of the brain as we feel physical pain, right? Psychological pain is felt in exactly the same place as we feel physical pain, and the brain deals with it in effect in the same way by just upregulating the endorphin system and flooding the brain with endorphins. But one of the side consequences of that in the end is that it hits lots of other systems, and it does seem to interfere with the menstrual endocrinology system, because what that seems to do is shut down the biochemical processes involved right at the start in producing gonadotrophins right at the start of that cascade. And that seems to be, there's a lot of kind of uncertainty in that literature as to exactly what's going on at the biochemical level. But it seems that prolactin, for example, is actually operating probably through the endorphin system to actually shut it down. So it's a kind of mechanism that seems to be there to manage fertility or the risk of fertility in the light of your context. So if your circumstances aren't very good, it's not a good idea to reproduce. And that whole system then in effect allows you to prevent ovulation and therefore conception happening in contexts where it might be detrimental because of the stresses under which you're living, whether those are social stresses or physical stresses, might be make the whole process of pregnancy that follows difficult to sustain. And essentially that seems to be the story.
Thank you. That's a very fascinating side of endorphins that I think most of us don't actually know.
No, I don't think a lot of people don't worry, as they say. That whole literature just seems not to, although it was worked out initially 40 years ago and has been kind of being examined and studied in great detail in labs all around the world, fertility labs all around the world ever since. It seems to have not crept out. Psychologists are not aware of these findings, seemingly, and never have been. It's weird. The consequence of the fact that science has exploded so much, it's impossible even to keep up with your literature in your little subfields, never mind worrying about what other people are finding. So it's just overload that's causing people not to look around unless they really have to. I have to say, I wouldn't know much about it, except that I happened to talk a lot to Barry Cavern when I was a young postdoc in Cambridge, and watched some of his experiments being done on monkeys, and realized that here was this mechanism that actually was very important. Took another 25, 30 years to figure out why it was important for us. But it was kind of sitting at the back of my brain for a very long time before one day the light suddenly went on, and I went, oh, so that's what's happening.
I guess that's why people now are more like they're trying to do more interdisciplinary research, and
Sure.
It's always better to connect with people from different fields and not to be too stuck in your own.
Yeah, and I'm afraid the answer, well, not the, I'm afraid, but the answer is you have to go and drink with them, right? You have to talk to them, because you're not going to really find out just from reading stuff, because it's like trying to find a needle in the haystack to find the right bit you want, because this, the number of papers published each year is monumental. So the only way to kind of really find out about these things is to actually talk to the guys who do it, and even that can be chance luck, really. And there's chance luck that Barry Cavern happened to be at King's when I was at King's. So meeting him over lunch one day. Well, I knew his name because he worked on reproductive endocrinology in those days, more of a neuroscientist now. But, there was some common interest or a reason to start talking to him over lunch.
Yeah, to semi-quote the president of my college, she did mention good science always happens in pubs. So
Yes,
that's a fun way to do science, I guess.
absolutely.
So there's one question on Zoom from Carlos. So how does ranking in the primates affect fertility? Do the top rank males copulate with all females or only with the top ranked ones?
Well, the issue is the effect it has, rank has on the fertility of the females. So they're not going to copulate if the females are not coming into estrus, or nobody's going to copulate with the females if they're not coming into estrus. So if you have a very steep dominance hierarchy and they're quite grumpy with each other, then what you're going to get is an accumulation of stresses kind of building up down the hierarchy, and the top ranking females will have normal kind of fertility more or less, and the lowest ranking females will have very low fertility. So most of the mating, if that's the case, will go towards the high ranking females. But the males are not interested in the ranks of the females in terms of mating. You know, what they are trying to do is maximize the number of sirings they're going to get, and particularly so since for most species, any species of mammal, males have a very limited period during which they're competitive enough against other males to be able to mate with the females. So it tends to be quite a limited period of time for which a male is at the top of the dominance hierarchy in something like a primate group, and therefore has access to the females. And his problem is just to keep everybody else out, all the other males away, if you like, as much as he can, in order to monopolize these sirings he gets from the females, because you know in a year or two he'll be ousted down at the bottom of the hierarchy and not able to mate with anybody. Now the females are playing another complex. That's the sort of male side of the story. The females are engaged in equally complicated, well, more complicated strategies sometimes, because on the whole they tend not to be so keen on high-ranking males because they're a bit tend to be a bit aggressive. Just that's how they got to be high-ranking, and they'll often prefer to mate with mid-ranking males, not with low-ranking males usually, but mid-ranking males. So they often play quite complicated games trying to trade off illicit matings, if you like, with the males they prefer to mate with in places where the high-ranking males can't see them. So they'll you see this in chimpanzees. Females will often persuade a kind of mid-ranking male to go off on their own with them into the forest where nobody else can see them, while the kind of high-ranking dominant males are sort of milling around in with the rest of the group and don't miss them and don't notice they've gone away. So mating systems in primates can get quite complicated, but it's not a case of kind of a correlation between male rank and female rank normally anyway, as to who mates with who. Normally matings, if you have what's called a priority of access model, where the dominant male tries to keep everybody else out, which is what you get in many, many species, red deer, feral goats, many of the primates. The dominant males will try to keep the other males away from the females where they can't fertilize the offspring, females' offspring, which of course, you know, then depends how well they can do that, depends on the size of the group, in other words, the number of other males in the group. And once you get above about 4 or 5 males, adult males and reproductive males in the group, it becomes extremely difficult for dominant males to police that process so effectively. So you tend to get a breakdown in the correlation between rank and mating success that you otherwise tend to get if there are fewer females. So in gorilla groups where you only have one serious male, normally the silverback The other males will be blackbacks, who are more like subadults and not so competitive. The silverback will get all the matings. If you get in baboons, where you've perhaps got 8 or 10 adult males in the group competing against each other, it's much more difficult for the dominant males to kind of police the process.
Thank you. So yeah, if any of you have any more questions, feel free to continue posting them, or you could just unmute and ask your questions. And as it's going to be 7 p.m., I think if there are no other questions, I would like to thank Professor Dunbar for his wonderful talk, discussing things such as problems faced by animals with different social styles and how they manage this trade-off between fertility and predation risk. So thank you very much for your time, Professor Dunbar, for joining us for the second time, because unfortunately, the connection problem last time, but thank you very much for...
You're very welcome. You're very welcome.
For doing this again. And yeah, just before we finish the talk, I would like to just tell everyone about the AGM that we will be having quite soon. So on 3rd of March. So for anyone who wants to submit their manifestos, you could do so by the 1st of March, and our AGM will be on the 3rd of March. And yeah, for more information, feel free to follow us on our social media accounts. And then our next talk will be on the 5th of March by the head of research, Dr. Thomas Morrell. His talk will be on coding cells for health. So once again, thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
Very good. Thank you.